Vakar hugged Camus Morgi, and not long after, the demon took control of her body and mentioned that she was delighted to meet him. Sarah was somewhat surprised to see Vakar, revealing that she had heard a lot about him from her roommate. The eyes of our boy began to shine with fury and his gaze fixed on her. The spikes had pierced Vakar's body, leaving him seriously injured, but even so he remained calm and questioned what she had done to Camus Morg. Sarah's attention focused on Vakar and her eyes began to shine with contempt. With a smile she asked if Vakar was worried about Camus Morg. The eye that Sarah had on her forehead began to show Camus Morgi trapped inside her body. The demon's eyes expanded with evil, and with a smile, she revealed that Camus Morgi was sleeping deeply inside her, since she had the right to take over her body for one day. She mocked our boy, asking how long he thought he would keep hugging her. Sarah used her powers, and in the blink of an eye, several skeletons wielding spears appeared above them, ready to attack. Vakar raised his head and his attention fixed on them, seeing that the skeletons were ready to attack. He could not help but go on alert. The skeletons attacked fiercely using the spears, but just before the attack could connect, Vakar stopped hugging Camus Morg, jumped and landed far from the area, dodging the attack at the last second. Sarah stood up and began to observe Vakar in silence. While the demon's eyes were glowing, she touched the bodies of the skeletons, making them turn into ashes. With a demonic smile, she mentioned that they were inside Andromalius' exclusive trap. Realizing that Vakar was the one who had killed her comrade, she couldn't believe that the guy Camus was looking for was that demon hunter. She started touching her chin with her hand, began to gaze toward the sky, and her eyes widened in confusion. For her it was strange, since she didn't know how there could be a person who knew so much about them, the 10 elite corpses. Sarah extended her hands and began to walk toward our boy, remembering that he had a soul that not even she had been able to find with her demonic eye. She did not know if Vakar was really from this world. Vakar, who had his hand resting on the ground, began to observe her in silence and did not say a single word. Upon noticing Vakar's silence, a smile spread across Sarah's face. According to her, he was a cold man, so she assumed he would respond if she told him the pitiful stories of Camus Morg. In an instant, the wounds that the spikes had left on Vakar's body disappeared as if nothing had happened. Vakar began to stare at the demon with a gaze full of fury. Sarah revealed that to see a man, Camus Morgi dabbled in the forbidden spell of complete resurrection. She explained that Camus Morgi had failed, resulting in her being unable to move her body. In the destroyed room, she remained lying on the floor for several days. She had already tried everything and no longer had the will to live. The demon asked if Vakar wanted to know something funny. Sarah's eyes began to shine with evil, and with an arrogant smile, she began pointing at herself, revealing that just before she could die, a demon appeared to give her new hope. Upon hearing this, Vakar's eyes began to shine with hatred and rage. Sarah mocked him, saying that after forming the contract, it had been heartbreaking to hear Camus Morgi long for him. Vakar began to imagine Camus Morgi thrown on her knees with her hands on her head and crying. She regretted having sent him away alone, her eyes filled with tears and guilt, since if only she hadn't been captured by the barbarians, none of this would have happened. She wished she had died instead of Vakar. While her body was lying on the ground, she couldn't help but wonder why Vakar hadn't come to see her, begging not to be left alone. With a smile, the demon began to imitate Camus Morgi's voice, saying that she missed him. Consumed by hatred, Vakar drew his sword and lunged at her, seeing that he was ready to attack. Sarah extended her hands and a smile appeared on her face. With a cold gaze, Vakar swung his sword forcefully, but just before the sword could harm her, Vakar stopped. Vakar's attention was fixed on the sword and her eyes began to shine with joy. With an arrogant smile, she realized that Vakar was well versed in contracts formed with demons. If she died, Camus Morgi would also die. Sarah activated the magic circle that was on the ground, causing an undead to emerge from it, which opened its mouth and prepared to devour Vakar. She was confident that Vakar could not kill the girl who was desperately waiting for him. The undead closed its jaw, but Vakar reacted in time and with a jump dodged the attack. Then he began to gaze toward the ground with a furious expression and prepared to counterattack. Our boy approached the undead and launched a chain of powerful slashes, but to his surprise, His attacks didn't work. Seeing this, Vikar couldn't help but feel somewhat confused, while Sarah's eyes were shining with excitement. With a smile, she asked if Vikar believed that she was going to use magic he could cut like Camus magic, revealing that there was no way a simple graduator could stand against her true power. The undead gained momentum and struck Vikar hard using its jaw. The attack was so powerful that our boy couldn't move. The undead took advantage and began running quickly, slamming Vikar's body against the ground. Using all its strength, the undead smashed Vikar's body against the sword's statue. The attack was so powerful that the statue of the sword cracked and blood began to emerge again from Vikar's wounds. Sarah mocked him, saying that far from saving her, he was going to end up dying. Vikar, who was wounded, began to gaze toward the ground and did not move. The memories of when he had fought against the spider, Madam, came to Vikar's mind. Even though she was a powerful beast, Vikar drew his sword and prepared to fight. He could not believe that Camus Morg had made a contract with the demon to save him, realizing that hiding in the deep forest had caused Camus Morgu's future as a hero to transform into that of a contractor of the demon. He began imagining a knight killing a man, knowing that in order to kill a demon who had made a contract with a human, one must first kill the human who had made the contract. This was something he knew from the beginning. The eyes of our boy began to shine with fury and his gaze fixed on Sarah. He didn't know why he had said that. He was determined not to lose against a demon. While he was sunk in his thoughts, Sarah's tail wrapped around Vikar's foot. Vikar didn't move. Using her tail, Sarah lifted Vikar's foot and noticed that he was thinking too much while fighting. Her eyes began to shine with rage, and without wasting another second, she forcefully moved her tail, making Vikar's body shoot out and crash into one of the statues. The impact was so strong that cracks appeared in the statue. Despite being injured, Vikar clenched his fists and began to imagine a scale. On one side was Camus Morgu and on the other her family and the barbarians. Vikar knew that if he didn't kill the 10 elite corpses, humanity would face the time of downfall. It was either Camus Morgi or all of humanity. It was clear to Vikar which of the two options he had to choose. The sad memories of Camus Morgu's life flooded Vikar's mind, making his eyes begin to shine with hope. He began to pant heavily since if there was even a silver of hope, he wanted to cling to it. Sarah climbed onto the palm of an undead and approached Vikar, who had his body crashed against the statue. She couldn't believe that the 9th and 10th elite corpses had been defeated by a human who wasn't even that strong. Sarah's eyes began to shine with evil. Using her sharp claw, she prepared to attack, asking if Vikar was aware that he was the reason for the delay in opening the door to the demonic realm. Vikar had no strength to react to the attack and could not even move. Sarah attacked with all her strength, making her claw pierce through Vikar's chest, destroying the statue into pieces in the process. Smoke began to emerge from the area. The demon drove her claw even deeper into Vikar's chest, causing him to open his mouth and start screaming in agony. With his body trembling, Vikar tried to move his hand. Sarah felt furious upon seeing that Vikar was still thinking about saving Camus, when he was just an insignificant graduate who couldn't even defeat her. Her eyes began to shine with evil and an arrogant smile appeared on her face, since after all Vikar was just a pathetic human waiting for a miracle to happen. Upon hearing the word miracle, Vikar began to think, and not long after he extended his hands and grabbed the demon's horns. Seeing this, Sarah's eyes widened in surprise and confusion. Vikar clenched his teeth tightly and mentioned that he liked the sound of that. Sarah's attention was fixed on him, and she couldn't help but go into shock. Just before she could take another breath, Vikar gave her a strong headbutt. The blow was so strong that Sarah's body began to tremble and her eyes started to shine with fear, causing her jaw to drop. Vikar gave the demon another headbutt, clenched his teeth and asked if Camus Morg could hear him. Sarah had her claw stuck in Vikar's chest. Our boy tightly grabbed the demon's horns and mentioned that it was hard for him to cut down this demon and save them all by himself. Vikar's voice began to sound until it reached Camus Morg, who was sleeping inside the demon. Our boy begged her to resist the contract since her contract with the demon, which was binding her soul, was not absolute. He trusted that she could do it since she was skilled in magic. Camus Morg, whose body was bound, did not wake up. Vikar revealed that her soul would burn his payment for going against the contract, but he was going to kill Ser at that very moment. With eyes shining with determination, Vikar began to shout, swearing that together they were going to create a miracle. Ser's attention fixed on him, and her eyes widened in fury. Consumed by rage, she pulled her claw out of Vikar's chest and gave him a powerful kick, making his body fly away. Our boy's body began to bounce on the ground until it crashed hard against another of the statues. Vikar descended to the ground and decided to turn Vikar into an undead soldier. She swore to make him work to cover for the 9th and 10th corpse and destroy humanity. She extended her hands and began to walk toward our boy. Vikar also descended to the ground and placed his hand on it. He stood up, and while he was wiping the blood from his chest, he swore to kill her. Vikar began to gaze at the ground and couldn't help but imagine the letter he had received. For him it was strange to think that the content of that letter, which he had believed was unreliable, would be his only hope now. With his body full of wounds, Vikar drew his sword and began to walk toward the demon. Our boy's attention was fixed on the statue of Hugo. He would have never thought that Hugo Le Baskerville would help him in this life. The demon Ser showed her true form. With a furious gaze, she drew her scythe and gave Vikar the order to die. Vikar began to stare at her intently, clenched his fist tightly, and his eyes began to shine with determination. He had never expected that he would become a swordmaster. Vikar could see Ser, who was tied inside the third eye of the demon. He began to observe her carefully, vowing to protect her. This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part. A few days ago, Hugo took out a pen and began to write a letter to Vikar. He knew that being a top-ranked graduate, the fang that Vikar was capable of making was a careless 7th technique. To perfect this technique, he had to become a sword master. Hugo was in his office, and while the sunlight was coming through the window, he continued writing. He was writing the process he had gone through to become a sword master. Hugo began to imagine himself holding the sword and with eyes shining with determination. He had become swordmaster shortly after Vikar was born. The image of Roxana and Penelope came to Hugo's mind. After losing them, he fell into despair and spent his days obsessed with the sword. Hugo spent all day swinging the sword in the training wing. Hugo began training at a very young age until he became an adult, and gradually his movements became more precise. At that time, his rank was top-ranking graduate, but to become a swordmaster, he had to wield his sword every day. After arduous training, Hugo gripped his sword tightly until several seconds later he opened his hand, letting the sword fall to the ground. Hugo began to observe his hands, and his eyes widened in desperation, making him sweat. He had trained so much that he had calluses and scratches on his hands. But no matter how much he wielded the sword, he could not reach the level of sword master. With the feeling that he was clinging to a burning nail, he checked the books in the library of 10,000 epistles and found it, the words of an ancient swordmaster who left them for his descendants. He opened the book, which contained a magic circle, and according to the book, to become a graduate one must discard all emotions. However, to become a swordmaster, one must recover their emotions. Hugo's personality began to shatter like a mirror. He decided to follow the words and worked hard to learn happiness, anger, sadness, and pleasure. He tried various ways of being happy, angry, sad, and excited. Hugo put his hands over his face and started to go crazy, since trying forcefully to create emotions had severe side effects. From a certain point on, he laughed when he needed to be angry and frowned when he needed to be happy. It had destroyed the way in which he expressed his emotions. That was how, little by little, the path toward becoming a swordmaster became a labyrinth with no exit. To satisfy his thirst that could not be quenched with his sword, he used his power to revive the family and had many children to increase his power. The image of his children crawling across the ground that was full of swords came into Hugo's mind. Following the rules of the family, he sent his small children to the cradle of swords. Hugo began to observe his children, and his eyes widened with surprise and fear as he had a realization in a place he did not expect. One of his children had jumped into the water. Hugo, the butler, and the others who were on the shore went on alert. He did not know for what reason a small baby, who knew nothing, would struggle so desperately, nor why the baby endured the pain of water seeping into his body. Hugo put his hand over his chest and his eyes widened in confusion. Watching that scene made his heart race, and mana began to emerge from his heart, the pleasure of finding great talent. The anger at sending a young man to such a horrible place, the sadness of seeing an injured youth, the joy of looking hopefully at that child's future consumed Hugo's mind. Without hesitating even for a second, Hugo entered the water amid those complex waves of emotions, and without hesitating even for a second, grabbed the child by the foot and pulled him out of the water. With this event he had his realization, and found out next day that he had become a sword master. Back to the present, Hugo continued writing the letter with a serious expression, including Pomeranian and becoming a sword master were things that Vicar had given him. He revealed that the path to becoming a sword master resided in how one was able to feel complex emotions. He trusted that Vicar could reach that level. Back to the combat, Serre sent mana into her scythe and swung it forcefully, launching a flurry of slashes. Vicar put his arms in front of his chest and using the Beelzebub sword blocked the attack, and his eyes filled with surprise, realizing that she was very strong. Vicar's eyes began to shine with rage, realizing that Hugo had become a completely different person from his previous life. While the demon Serre's eyes were shining with evilness, with a smile, she clenched her fist and summoned a powerful magic circle. To break Serre's magic, Vicar had to reach the level of sword master, and now that he no longer had the power of the Saintess, he had to come to his own realization. Serre extended her hand, and just then, a magic circle appeared on the ground, and from it emerged spikes made of skeletons, which struck Vicar's body directly, causing him to be thrown into the air. Our boy clenched his teeth and began to bleed from the mouth, just as Hugo had said. Anger and sadness existed within him. The spikes pierced Vicar's body, leaving a deep wound in his chest. Our boy's body began to bounce against the ground. Upon seeing this, Serre's eyes began to shine with joy and a smile appeared on her face, since she thought that Vicar was very weak. But soon her smile disappeared and her eyes filled with rage, causing her to clench her fist tightly. Despite having deep wounds and cuts all over his body, Vicar stood up, and while his eyes were shining with confidence, he began to stare at Serre with an excited smile. In this fight for Vicar it was impossible to feel joy and pleasure. Upon feeling Vicar's gaze, Serre became enraged and using all her strength, launched several slashes toward Vicar. Just before he could react, the slashes were already in front of his face. Vicar's attention was fixed on them and his eyes widened in fear and surprise. The attack was so fast that Vicar had no time to do anything about it, and he took the full brunt of the attack, creating a curtain of smoke. Serre, who had the scythe stuck into the ground, began to observe our boy in silence. Vicar's body was thrown into the air along with debris. Demon Serre's attack had cut off one of our boy's legs, while blood was emerging from his wounds. Vicar couldn't help but clench his teeth tightly and feel furious. With the little energy and strength that Vicar had, he used Baskerville's seventh technique and gaining momentum against the rocks appeared in front of Serre. Vicar began to stare at her, and while his eyes were shining with fury, he prepared to attack. Serre turned around and upon seeing that Vicar was ready to attack, went on alert. With a murderous gaze, Vicar forcefully swung the sword. The attack landed squarely against Serre's head, but then his sword bounced off. Seeing this, Vicar's eyes widened in confusion and many questions came to his mind. Meanwhile, on the other side, Serre couldn't help but smile. With an arrogant expression, she called Vicar piece of shit, realizing that he had no ability to learn. She grabbed Vicar by the face, revealing that it was impossible for him to break her armor. Vicar grabbed Serre's arm and his eyes filled with fear and surprise. While Serre's eyes were shining with evil, she threw Vicar, causing his body to crash against the ground, destroying it into pieces. According to her, Vicar's attacks were not powerful at all. She grabbed Vicar by the neck and while her body was releasing a demonic aura, she closed her eyes and with a smile couldn't help but wonder what it was that Vicar was trying to do. Vicar no longer had the strength to resist. Serre stepped forcefully on Vicar's chest and used her powers, causing a magic circle to appear under her feet and from it hands began to emerge. She mocked Vicar, questioning if he really believed that Camus was going to wake up and resist the demon's contract. Several red hands emerged from the magic circle, and one of them grabbed Vicar by the head. While smoke was coming out of Vikar's nose, he couldn't help but feel furious. Little by little, the hands began to cling to Vikar's body. In an instant, our boy was completely immobilized. Sarah's eyes began to shine with joy. She stood up, extended her hand toward the sky, and with a smile asked Vikar to try resisting the next attack. The magic circle appeared in the sky, and from it a horde of hands shot out toward Vikar. The hands struck Vikar's body with force, creating a large curtain of smoke over the area. The attack had been so powerful that there was now a crater in the ground, and in the middle was Vikar. Our boy had lost an arm, and there was a pool of blood beneath him. Despite having mortal wounds and his body covered in blood, Vikar began to move. Sarah's attention fixed on him, and her eyes began to shine with confusion. She started to observe our boy in silence. Supporting his hand on the ground, Vikar began to gaze toward the floor and prepared to stand up. Seeing that he had not died after receiving the last attack, she could not help but wonder if he was really human. Sarah began to walk toward our boy. The mere act of standing was exhausting. Even with the ability of the healing salamander, Vikar could no longer heal his body. Vikar began to remember when he had embraced Kamus Morgi with tears in her eyes, and with a sad gaze she asked why she was alone again. With his body trembling, Vikar decided to get up and move. The curtain of smoke began to disappear, and despite missing an arm, Vikar drew the Beelzebub sword and began to walk toward the demon. Just then, Kamus Morgi called Vikar an idiot, mentioning that she didn't want to see him again just to see that expression. Vikar's attention, who had a bruise on his eye, was fixed on Sarah, and his eyes widened in surprise, leaving him in shock. Sarah's eyes began to shine with confusion and rage, since she didn't know what was happening. Kamus Morg began to remove the demon's skin from her face, and her eyes began to shine with confidence. With a smile she said that she had done just as Vikar had said. Seeing this, Sarah panicked and reminded her that if she resisted the contract, her soul would be shattered. Using both hands, Kamus Morg began to remove the demon's skin from her face and neck, and with a confident smile admitted that Sarah couldn't last long, asking Vikar to cut her into pieces. She also revealed that if Vikar failed, then her neck would become his sheath. Our boy started to gaze toward the ground and let out a sigh. A smile appeared on his face upon seeing that she was making jokes in this situation. Realizing that she had truly been born to be a heroine, he decided to give her 100 points out of 100. Kamus Morg took off the demon skin she had on her neck, and with a smile asked if Vikar had realized that now. She extended her hand toward Vikar, asking him to show her the man she had fallen in love with. Sarah's eyes filled with fear, knowing that this was not good. Sarah took control of Kamus Morgu's body again, making a magic circle appear behind her back. According to her, they were crazy. With a furious gaze, she extended her hands and asked if Vikar really believed that this would be enough to pierce her at that moment. Tentacles made of skeletons shot out from the magic circle toward Vikar. Vikar drew his sword, and the blade began to emit an intense mana. Our boy started walking toward her and swung the sword with precision, cutting the tentacles into pieces. Sarah's attention focused on our boy, and her eyes widened in surprise, leaving her in shock. Vikar's heart began to shine, and mana started to emerge from it. He realized that this was what Hugo meant when he said the heart had so many emotions. He could feel emotions that he normally did not feel. Kamus Morgi was trapped with her arms tied inside the demon's third eye. She was happy that Vikar had not forgotten about her. With a sad gaze she began to lift her head. Gradually the light began to enter. Upon seeing this, Kamus Morg's eyes filled with tears and joy. Vikar cut the demon's third eye, and with a smile sat right in front of Kamus Morgi, and began to observe her with a joyful gaze. Upon seeing this, her jaw dropped in surprise. Vikar was angry because the heroine of the future was hurt, and he was sad because she was fighting alone. But he was also excited to have the perfect reunion of them. That was what was inside him. Vikar clenched his fist tightly, and an intense mana began to emerge from his sword. The eyes of our boy began to shine with excitement, and with a smile he swung the sword. In an instant, Vikar pierced through Sarah's body and appeared behind her. The demon froze in fear, not knowing what was happening. She turned her head, and her eyes began to shine with confusion. Vikar turned his back on her and started walking away. At that moment, Vikar's mana began to enter her body, causing her terrible pain. This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part, in this place there was a statue of Hugo. All the humans wore colored glasses that were not compatible with them while they lived their lives. Vikar clenched his fist tightly and the aura that was emerging from the Beelzebub sword began to solidify. Those who managed to take off those glasses could see things that could not be seen by the average human and could easily cut them down, and those people who had reached supremacy were known as sword masters. While Vikar's eyes were shining with hatred, he moved quickly and just before Ser could react, he swung the sword precisely, making a deep cut on her. Little by little, the demon aura that was around Camus Morg's body gradually began to emerge from her body, causing her to regain control of her own body. The demon's aura began to turn into ashes and Ser's eyes widened in fear and surprise as she couldn't believe that she had lost. She began to stare at Vikar and her eyes started to shine with rage since she had the mission of opening the gate. In a matter of seconds, the demon's aura disappeared and her body turned into ashes. Vikar, who had lost an arm during his fight against the demon and had his body covered in blood, began to gaze at the red sky while smoke was emerging from his shoulder, and he sank into his thoughts. He felt as if he were wearing outdated clothes. He could feel that his strength, sight, and decision-making abilities extended far beyond transcendence, which were traits he couldn't feel with the mana that the Saintess had drawn out of him before. The eyes of our boy began to shine with worry. He turned around and with a sad gaze could not help but wonder if she was okay. Behind him was Camus Morg lying on the ground. Vikar began to turn around and while the wind was blowing, he started walking towards her. He hoped to be able to share the emotion of their reunion. Once Vikar approached the body of Camus Morg, he began to feel a strange sensation and became paralyzed. Not long after, our boy also lost consciousness and fell to the ground, right next to Camus Morg. The Divine Immortal's ring that was lying on the ground activated, and a purple glow began to emerge from it. The ring was lying in the middle of the crater. Now that the enemy had been defeated, the glow that was emerging from the ring became more intense and shot up into the sky. The glow struck against the red sky and little by little the barrier that had been created with the power of the ring began to disappear. Vikar and Camus Morg, who were unconscious, did not notice anything that was happening and the ground beneath their feet disappeared, teleporting them back to the real world. It was night and the moon was shining high in the sky. Several hours passed and Vikar did not wake up. Noticing this, the little spider came out of his clothes and with small jumps reached his arm and began to observe him closely. The little spider began to make small jumps trying to wake Vikar up, and while she was distracted, someone wearing a skirt started walking towards them. The little spider got tired and lay down on the ground next to Vikar. Just then, her attention was fixed on something and her eyes widened in surprise and confusion. It was Rose. While her eyes were shining, she began to stare at Vikar in silence. With a penetrating gaze, she sank into her thoughts, not knowing what to do. Noticing her gaze, the little spider stood up and with a furious gaze began to roar, indicating that she was not going to let her harm Vikar. After giving the matter several thoughts, Rose extended her hand toward Vikar. But instead of hurting him, she passed the arm of Camus Morg, who was unconscious, over her own shoulder and helped her stand up. Upon seeing this, the little spider's attention fixed on them, and she couldn't help but feel somewhat confused. Several seconds passed and Vikar did not move. Rose turned her back to him and began to walk away carrying Camus Morgi on her shoulder. Just then, our boy placed his hand with his body trembling. Vikar stood up, pressed his hand against the wound on his arm, and with a lost gaze asked her to wait. Upon hearing his voice, Rose's eyes widened in surprise and she stopped walking. Upon seeing that she could move, he was sure that Camus Morgi was fine. For him, this was a relief. Rose's eyes began to shine with curiosity. She turned around and her gaze fixed on Vikar. Smoke began to emerge from the city. Vikar placed his hand over the wound on his shoulder, started looking down at the ground, and thought it was a shame that they couldn't have their reunion. But it was in both of their best interests to get away from this place as quickly as possible. Vikar put his hand into his pants pocket and mentioned that he had a request. He took something out of his pocket and threw it, asking her to give it to Camus Morg. Rose caught it with her hand and her eyes widened in surprise. With a cheerful gaze, Vikar extended his hand and with a smile revealed that Camus Morgue had to go there if she wanted to see him. Rose's attention was fixed on what Vikar had given her, and her eyes began to shine with curiosity. Without wasting any more time, she turned her back on Vikar and, carrying Camus Morgue on her shoulder, began to walk away from the area. The little spider climbed onto our boy's shoulder and both of their attention was fixed on Rose and Camus Morgue. They remained silently watching her. Back at the festival, someone started shouting because he had news. It was a man wearing a woman's costume. He began to run and a crowd of students gathered to see what was happening. The man revealed that the villain who had ambushed the academy had been the Night Hound. Upon hearing this, the students went into shock and asked how serious the damage was. The man replied that unexpectedly there hadn't been any damage. Bianca, who was wearing the Frankenstein costume, began to gaze toward the ground with a worried expression and realized that girl wearing that skull mask was a black mage. Tudor, who was wearing the Valkyrie costume, put his hand on his chin and began to think, believing that she was right, since it seemed that the black mage was fighting against the Night Hound. It was embarrassing for him to say this, but he had not dared to intervene between them. Piggy's eyes, who was wearing the fairy costume, began to shine with fear since he had been so scared that he thought he was going to faint. Tudor, who was wearing the martial arts master costume, began to look to one side and with a serious gaze admitted that the Night Hound was the most violent person he had ever seen. While they were distracted, Vicar, who was wearing the witch costume, began to walk toward them and admitted that he too had been so scared that he could not even breathe properly. Upon seeing Vicar, everyone's attention focused on him and their eyes widened with surprise and concern. They asked where he had gone, revealing that they were very worried. Our boy began to touch his head, not knowing what to say. Dullars crossed her arms and with a serious expression explained that they had not seen him at all while they were investigating the street. She asked where he had been. She knew him very well and knew that he would not leave his friends behind and hide. Sinclair, who was wearing the vampire costume, began to observe our boy in silence. Vicar's eyes filled with worry as he did not know what to say. Just then, someone wearing a skirt appeared behind them and, calling Vicar a commoner, asked how he had been able to go into the defense alone. They were High Boro, Middle Boro, and Low Boro, who were dressed as maids. Low Boro put his hands on his waist, and with an angry expression asked what would become of them if he kept doing things on his own, and asked Vicar not to do that next time. With a furious gaze, Middle Boro grabbed the broom tightly and ordered Vicar not to do that next time. The eyes of High Boro began to shine with hatred and with a penetrating gaze. He also gave the order to Vicar not to do that next time. They clenched their teeth and surrounded Vicar. Sinclair closed her eyes and couldn't help but smile, and thought that he was creating a gang. The eyes of Dolores widened in surprise when she realized that she had misunderstood the situation again. Several minutes later, the rays of the sun began to illuminate the sky. With a worried gaze, Vicar began to contemplate the sky without knowing if she was going to be okay. The sun began to rise over the horizon. Everyone began to contemplate this beautiful scene. Vicar was going to be waiting eagerly to see Camus Morgue again. Somewhere in the city there was an abandoned church, and in the middle of the church there was a sphere. Next to it stood Rose. Someone who had a wet body emerged from the sphere and began to walk. This person was none other than Camus Morgue. She placed her hand on the door of the sphere, and with a lost gaze came out of it. Rose turned toward her and began to observe her in silence. Camus Morgue started looking at her hands. Her body was a mess since Serre had gone mad and broken their contract, and because of that she hadn't been able to greet Vicar. She felt furious for thinking that Vicar was dead like an idiot. Rose, who was standing next to her, didn't say a single word. Camus Morgue sank into her thoughts and remembered what he had done for her. She put her hands on her cheeks and couldn't help blushing, since the fact that Vicar had done everything possible to keep her from getting hurt, even though he was full of wounds, meant that he valued her. She remembered when she had taken off the demon's skin from her neck, and the image of Vicar smiling came to her mind. This time she had fought with him and hadn't left by herself. She closed her eyes and a smile spread across her face when she thought that Vicar and she had achieved this because they hadn't given up. She was so tired that she had dark circles under her eyes. She turned to one side and asked if Vicar wasn't a man worth risking her life for. Next to her was the demon Ser. Camus Morgue began to show an arrogant smile. Ser began to stretch her ears and with eyes full of tears asked how she could have gone against the contract. According to her, this was a scam. With a curious expression, Camus Morgue revealed that now she had full control over her body. She didn't know if Vicar had broken her contract with Ser or why she hadn't died. Little Ser clenched her fists and her eyes began to shine with hatred, revealing that because she had broken their 12-hour contract, thanks to the penalty she could live for a short time. Camus Morgue's attention was fixed on Ser and purple fire began to emerge from her palm. Using her powers, she summoned 2 small magical barriers which began to crush Ser's body. With a smile, Camus Morgue revealed that now she could crush and kill her using only magic. Using her hands, Ser began to resist being crushed by the magical barriers and couldn't help but scream in agony. With her body trembling and eyes full of tears, she begged Camus Morgue not to kill her, swearing to do anything. Upon hearing this, Camus Morgue's eyes began to shine with wickedness, and a smile spread across her face in exchange for sparing her life. Camus Morgue wanted her to give her all her powers and authorities. Now that they no longer had a contract, they were master and slave. With a sad gaze, Ser turned her back and let out a sigh. Camus Morgue put her hand on her waist and remembered that thanks to her, she had been able to meet Vicar. Ser asked what she was going to do now. Camus Morgue began to observe her and said it was time to open the gate. Upon hearing this, Ser's eyes began to shine with joy and surprise. With a curious gaze, she asked if she was really going to do that. With a smile, Camus Morgue said that she was joking and asked if Ser thought that she was crazy. Rose began to help Camus Morgue put on the wizard robe and revealed that her first priority now was to return to the Morgue estate. She began to imagine her uncle Adolphe and her mother now that she knew Vicar was alive. She had to restore the things she had destroyed. She put on the wizard's hood and her eyes began to shine with sadness. She started to remember her Uncle Snake showing a smile before dying. She had to return to the Morgue estate and announce and mourn the death of her master. She clenched her fist and with a gaze full of gratitude, she thanked Snake from the bottom of her heart, since thanks to him she had been able to reunite with Vicar. She opened her hand and began to observe a golden coin. A smile spread across her face because if she entered the academy she could be Vicar's junior. Rose and Ser began to look at her with a confused gaze. The wind began to blow, carrying all the leaves away. Camus Morgue couldn't help but blush and with eyes full of love swore that Vicar was going to be hers the day they met. This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part, the hectic festival finally came to an end. However, even after the festival ended, its aftermath remained like burning embers. It was daytime and the students were heading towards the academy. Among them there were 3 boys. One of them asked his friends if it was true that the Night Bloodhound had come to the academy during the festival. The boy wearing glasses turned his head towards his friends, and with a serious gaze revealed that he had heard that the Night Bloodhound had come to commit another attack. The blonde-haired boy began to observe his friend, and with a sincere expression said that according to rumors the teachers had intervened to stop the Night Hound. Upon hearing this, the black-haired student's eyes widened with disdain and fear. According to him, the Night Hound was someone evil who deserved to be immediately locked up in prison. Then, he closed his eyes, extended his hands and mentioned that it was said that this time a new villain had also appeared, an unregistered black mage. With a sincere gaze, the boy wearing glasses turned towards them and explained that he had heard that the 2 villains fought each other and thanks to that, the teachers were able to stop them quickly. The blonde-haired boy began to observe his friends in silence, without interrupting. The 3 friends continued talking among themselves with smiles on their faces, and passed near the wall that had been destroyed by Vicar's attack. The students, unaware of anything, chatted happily with carefree voices. The Night Bloodhound incident, which could have ended in a terrifying tragedy if it hadn't been contained, seemed to fade away like a simple and chilling rumor. The students entered the academy and began heading toward their classrooms. Somewhere down the hallway there was a door. It was the journalism club. Inside were all the members of the club sitting around a table that was full of newspapers. Dollars stood up, placed her hand on top of the table, and with an angry expression demanded to know who had written this article. Vikar and the others began to observe the articles in silence. Among the articles, there was one with a photograph of the night bloodhound with eyes shining with evil and covered in blood stains. The article was about the atrocities of the night hound. His misdeeds had surpassed all limits since he had attacked the Imperial Academy, according to the person who had written the article. The acts of the night hound were premeditated, so he was considered anti-humanitarian and anti-state, a villain that must be punished without fail. During the festival, among the main facilities destroyed in the Imperial Capital War, the Imperial Bank, the Capital Clock Tower, the Indulgentia Orphanage, and the Imperial National Cemetery. Dollars took hold of the article with her hand, and while her eyes were shining with rage, she began to stare at Vikar and at everyone else, making it clear that even though Night Hound had come to the festival, he had not caused any commotion. Chaos had been caused by that mysterious black mage. Everyone's attention was fixed on Dollars, and their eyes widened in surprise and confusion, while on the other hand, our boy showed no emotion. Dollars had read the article, and according to her it seemed as if the Night Hound had come to the festival to massacre the students, and even though she knew that he was a criminal according to the laws of the Empire, she was certain that that day during the festival he had done nothing out of the ordinary. According to her, the article should focus more on facts and less on emotions, simply listing the facts. She demanded to know who had written this article. With a nervous gaze, Piggy began shaking his hands in denial. Tutor's attention focused on Piggy and his eyes expanded with fear and panic. He did not know what to say. While on the other hand, with a calm expression, our boy began observing the articles in silence. Dollar's attention was fixed on Vikar, and her eyes began to shine with seriousness upon realizing that the person who had written the article was him. Vikar argued that he had written the article according to the instructions of Professor Venci Morg, the club's advisor. Dollars placed her hands on the table and felt furious, since all this had happened while she was not present. Vikar began to observe her with a serene expression and remembered that she had been busy during the festival season with her student council duties. Upon hearing this, her eyes began to shine with confusion. She put her hands into the pocket of her pants, and while taking something out, let out a sigh and explained that if she was not present it did not mean that they should write an article without verifying the facts. She took out 3 articles that she had in her pocket and left them on top of the table, placed her hand on top of them, revealing that they were official statements issued this morning by the Imperial Guard. They assured that the one responsible for destroying the main facilities of the capital had not been Nightblood Hound. She took 3 photographs of the facilities where the Nightblood Hound had been. It was night and everything was destroyed, but there were strange marks on the ground. She knew that the main weapon of the Nightblood Hound was a sword, but upon observing the recent scenes of the attacks, there were almost no sword marks. Only traces remained as if a gigantic snake had crawled through the place. She began to imagine a woman holding a whip and surrounded by a white snake with purple eyes. She revealed that the official name of this villain was Ms. Al-Rabaraz, a creature whose gender identity was presumed female. The motive for the attack was unknown. It was estimated that she had the same level as a graduator, and the weapon she used had not been revealed. She revealed that all witnesses were dead. Upon hearing this, Tutor's and Sancho's eyes widened in surprise and fear, putting them on alert. Dollars, who had one hand resting on the table, began to show 3 fingers with the other, and while her eyes were shining with seriousness, she started to stare at Vikar and asked him not to keep blaming all the evil deeds on the Nightblood Hound. There were 3 villains, so they should clearly distinguish the crimes committed by each one. With a serene expression, Vikar did not say a single word, until several seconds later, he nodded his head. Actually, this did not matter much to him since he was criticizing the Nighthound in case someone suspected him in the future. He was just trying to create an antagonistic image between them. Tutor crossed his hands, rested his head on them, and while his eyes were shining with curiosity and fear, he could not help but wonder where the new villain Ms. Ouroboros had come from. Sancho crossed his arms, and with a serene gaze mentioned that the only thing they knew about her was that she left marks that looked like a giant snake had passed through there. With a surprised gaze, Sinclair raised her hand and asked how they were sure that she was a woman. Dollars placed her hands on top of the table, and with a serious expression began to imagine a rock with a lipstick mark, revealing that in all her crime scenes there was a lipstick mark, realizing that she wanted everyone to know that she had been the one who had committed them. Piggy extended his hands to the sides and his eyes began to shine with confusion. Tudor started to show a finger and everyone began to chat among themselves. Vikar, who was sitting among them, began to look at the ground in silence. Vikar's attention was fixed on Dollars and his eyes began to shine with rage. He did not know if the new villain idolized or felt resentment towards the Night Hound, but he did not care what her objective was since he would have to eliminate her if she crossed his path during his demon hunt. At that moment, Anna, who was holding a pile of papers, kicked open the door and announced her arrival. She approached the table and left the papers on top. Dollar's attention was fixed on them and her eyes filled with confusion because she did not know what all these documents were. With a sincere gaze, Anna explained that they had received a lot of reports after the festival concluded. She took out a letter, approached Vikar and revealed that there was also a letter for him. Vikar began to look towards the ground and with a calm expression, extended his hand to take the letter and thanked her. Vikar took the letter and opened it. His eyes filled with confusion upon seeing that this letter was for him. Upon reading the content of the letter, Vikar's eyes widened in surprise, making him panic. While he was distracted reading the letter silently, Sinclair approached him and her attention fixed on the letter. She felt curious to know what it contained. The letter was a notice of payment for the first semester tuition. The next day, Vikar went to visit his brother and the little Pomeranian sat on his knees. She closed her eyes and could not help but smile and feel happy. Osiris mentioned that he could provide him with the money for his tuition. Osiris, who was sitting on the sofa in front of Vikar, picked up a cup of tea and while the sun rays were entering the room, asked what was really bothering Vikar. Our boy started to gaze towards the floor and sank into his thoughts, then began to pet the head of the little Pomeranian, and with a sincere expression said that he wanted to hide that he was a Baskerville while at the academy. Feeling that Vikar was petting her, Pomeranian placed her hands on top of Vikar's hands and could not help but feel even happier. The reality was that Vikar did not want his daily life to become complicated after it was discovered that he used the Baskerville's money. He began to imagine Sinclair, Bianca, and Dolores offering him disguises with a loving gaze. He knew he only had 1 week until the enrollment deadline, but he did not want to take on any of the jobs that the girls had suggested. Vikar closed his eyes and felt worried since not receiving the full scholarship due to his behavior had caused him problems. Osiris prepared to take a sip of tea and his attention focused on Vikar. His eyes widened with curiosity since he wondered why Vikar was trying so hard to hide his skills. But then his mind was filled with surprise as a realization came to his mind. He could not help but wonder if Vikar wished to become the powerful hero who hid his strength. In the past, while the children were playing, little Osiris crossed his arms and stood in front of a tree. He began to blush imagining himself defeating a horde of monsters. There was a time when he also longed to be someone like that, hiding his strength and living among the weak before revealing his true power at the right moment. In a matter of seconds, the little Pomeranian fell asleep like a log. With a calm expression, Osiris suggested to our boy the idea of dedicating himself to monster hunting part-time. Vikar's attention fixed on his brother and his eyes widened in surprise. Osiris suggested going to the Explorers Guild and hiring an explorer to go hunt monsters with him. He was willing to give our boy more opportunities to make his dream come true. With a confused gaze, Vikar began touching his chin since he didn't know if that would help him make his dream come true. With a serious gaze, Vikar sank into his thoughts. Thinking about the Explorers Guild, he remembered that there was an explorer who interested him. He began to imagine a swordsman with a ponytail. He was one of the heroes who had made a great contribution to the human coalition when the era of ruin arrived. Most of the field guides on demonic creatures that he knew had been created thanks to him. Later, the school of monster sonography had also been based on his research. Vikar remembered his tragic death, knowing that this guy was a country bumpkin who was not affiliated with anyone. During a battle with demons, he had no one to support him, which led to his premature death. Our boy knew a lot about him. A smile appeared on his face when he thought that he should earn this guy's trust while he was alive for the sake of the future. He thanked his brother and decided to do so. Upon hearing this, Osiris' eyes filled with joy and he could not help but feel happy. Somewhere in the city was the guide guild called Sherpa. It was starting to get dark and someone announced that the guild master was back. One of the men asked how today's hunt had been. The guild master stomped on the ground forcefully, making the men's jaws drop in surprise. The guild master, a blond man, carried on his back the body of a giant boar. He began to point at the boar with his thumb, and while his eyes were shining with confidence, he began to show a smile and said that the hunt had been a complete success. This guy was called Miniature Pincher Aka Mini Pin. He left the boar's body on the ground and people approached to see the beast. They had no doubt that the graduates were on another level. Mini Pin started to move towards the guild door and decided to take a break. He entered his office, sat down and started reading a book. Mini Pin rested his head on the table, started touching his head with his hand and felt worried, since they were in trouble again this month. He did not have enough money to cover their food expenses and the salaries of the guild members. His eyes filled with worry and sadness since due to the large guilds of mercenaries, he could not do what he wanted, and it was normal that he was so distressed for not having support. He stood up, knowing that it was all his fault, since if he had not been scammed when he was young while trying to pursue his dream, now he would not be struggling financially. He opened a drawer which contained a towel. Mini Pin grabbed the towel and felt like an idiot, closing his eyes. He wiped the sweat from his face. If there was still an opportunity, he wanted to pursue his dream. He intertwined his hands and began to imagine the symbol of the Baskerville family. His dream was to enter the Baskerville family. At that moment, someone wearing brown boots began to walk through the area. This person wore a hood. He approached the body of the boar and asked if anyone knew where Mini Pin was. Upon hearing this, the attention of the men focused on him. With a serious gaze, the man approached the hooded man and noticed that this guy was young. He asked how someone like him dared to say their guild master's name so casually. The hooded man said that he was just a client who had come to make a commission. Upon hearing this, the other man asked if he believed that clients could act as if they were superior. Without wasting another second, the hooded man turned his back on him and walked away thinking that this guy was very annoying. Seeing this, the blond man's eyes widened in surprise. With a furious gaze, he turned around and tried to grab him. But at that moment, the hooded person moved like thunder and shifted away, leaving the man in shock. He and his men tried to catch the hooded man. But with a murderous gaze, the man moved quickly, avoiding being caught. Then, he took momentum and made a jump, until he appeared right in front of the guildmaster's office window. Upon feeling this, Mini Pin's eyes, who had his hands intertwined, were filled with surprise. The hooded man stood at the window and asked if this was the guildmaster's room. Judging by Mini Pin's build, he realized that he was the guildmaster. Upon hearing this, Mini Pin's eyes widened in confusion. He stood up, clenched his fist and with a confused gaze demanded to know who he was. The hooded man sat on the window and revealed that he was a client who had come to make a commission. Mini Pin's face filled with sweat and his jaw dropped in surprise. The man got down from the window, approached Mini Pin, took out a sheet and revealed that it was his commission request. Mini Pin's attention fixed on him and he could not help but go on alert, realizing that this guy was fast. He was so fast that he had not had time to react, realizing that he was someone very skilled. Mini Pin took the commission request and began to read carefully, but made it clear that he could not come here without making an official request. But then his eyes widened in surprise, leaving him in shock. The hooded man began to remove his hood and revealed that the guide he wanted to hire was Mini Pin. Upon hearing this, the guild master's body began to tremble. The hooded man could not forget the famous person who visited endlessly the Baskerville family because he wanted to become a vassal. Minnie Pin's face filled with sweat and his eyes filled with fear. The hooded person was none other than Vikir. This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part, after a few hours, night fell, Minnie Pin and Vikir were walking through the village. Minnie Pin was reading the request report of our boy, and according to the request, he had affiliation with the Colosseum Academy, and the reason for the request was that he wanted to hire a guide for the purpose of killing monsters. While Vikir was walking beside him with a serious gaze, Minnie Pin's attention was fixed on our boy, and he couldn't help but blush and feel somewhat surprised. He couldn't believe that this boy truly belonged to the Baskerville family. Minnie Pin stood in front of Vikir and bowed his head before him as a sign of respect. For him it was an honor to work with someone like Vikir. Upon seeing his attitude, our boy couldn't help but feel somewhat confused. With a sincere expression, Minnie Pin admitted that he really wished he could see a member of the Baskerville family at least once. Vikir began to observe him, and with a serious gaze asked him not to make so much noise and to calm down a little. Minnie Pin apologized, revealing that his dream was to join the Baskerville family. Upon hearing this, Vikir's eyes began to shine with surprise, thinking calmly and seeing that from this time Minnie Pin wished to become a servant of the Baskervilles. He realized that then, before he returned in time, Minnie Pin must have dreamed about it for a long time. Minnie Pin clenched his fists and, blushing with excitement, mentioned with a smile that the Baskervilles were a family that subdued monsters on the Western Front, known as the Iron-Blooded Sword family. He knew that if he became a member of the family, they would teach him the invincible fencing of the Baskerville style. With a depressed gaze, Minnie Pin began to touch his head, and in a sincere tone admitted that he wanted to get a house, and also some land. He had thought that was the only way to give his wife a good life, but unfortunately, he had been scammed by brokers and his whole life had gone to waste. Vikir's eyes began to shine with seriousness. He knew that although Minnie Pin seemed weak, he was a supreme graduate. He was at a level where he could even belong to the highest mercenary guild. Vikir began to look down at the ground and with a smile revealed that he could make that dream come true, but that was going to depend on what Minnie Pin did. Upon hearing this, Minnie Pin's eyes widened in surprise, and then an excited smile appeared on his face. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. With a gaze full of emotion, he promised to work hard. After a few hours, Minnie Pin was driving a carriage full of goods in the middle of the night. Our boy had a secret mission, so for this reason he attended the academy undercover. It was a secret even within the family, so he received no help from Baskerville. For this reason, he had turned to Minnie Pin, the most capable guide in this area, to help him pay his tuition. Upon hearing this, Minnie Pin put his hand over his mouth and his eyes filled with tears and surprise. He couldn't believe that the person he respected most within Baskerville, Vikir, had personally praised him. Vikir was sitting among the merchandise. Our boy clasped his hands and with a serene expression asked Minnie Pin to call him employer from now on and not by his name. While Minnie Pin's eyes were shining with determination, he clenched his fist and said he would keep that in mind. Vikir began to observe Minnie Pin with a curious expression and explained that he was a student at the academy and asked which monsters were not so strange, even if he hunted many of them. With a sincere expression, Minnie Pin turned his head toward him and with a smile explained that the Knoll was a monster that was not too strong, but still could be worth a lot. Knoll was a strange creature with the head of a hyena and the body of a dwarf that lived in groups in the highlands on the outskirts of the ecliptic. The individual risk level was only C+, but when they gathered as a colony, it could reach up to maximum A. Minnie Pin, who was driving the merchandise carriage, explained that since these monsters' individual combat power was weak, even a first-year student from the academy could easily hunt many of them, so Vikir would not be very suspicious. And since it was an ecosystem disruptor designated by the imperial family, there was a reward per head. Their skin, meat, and even bones could be sold. Vikir began to observe Minnie Pin closely and noticed that this guy was really competent. A few hours later, they arrived at the habitat of the Knoll, and the merchandise carriage stopped. The area was full of gnolls. Some carried swords as weapons and others were prowling around the area. Vikyr and Minnie Pin hid behind the bushes and their attention was fixed on the monsters. With a serious gaze, Minnie Pin began to point at the monsters with his finger and revealed that they had the habit of collecting shiny things. So the most common hunting method was to scatter glass balls to attract them and kill them. Vikyr, who was sitting next to him, remained silently watching the monsters. While his eyes were shining calmly, he realized that this was a method one should use when encountering a small number of gnolls. Upon hearing this, Minnie Pin's eyes widened in surprise and he nodded his head since Vikyr's analysis was accurate. While they were talking, a snake that was hidden in the branches of a tree began to look at them with a murderous gaze. Just before the snake could take another breath, someone attacked with a fierce slash, cutting the snake's head in half. Minnie Pin's eyes filled with fear and confusion since he didn't know how Vikyr had cut the snake without a sword. The snaky's head fell to the ground. Vikyr began pointing backward with his thumb and with a curious gaze asked if there was oil in the barrels of the carriage. With his face full of sweat, Minnie Pin nodded. Blood began to emerge from the corpse of the snake. Vikyr's cut had been clean. Our boy felt happy because with the barrels of oil they were going to be able to eliminate the entire colony with minimal battle. Minnie Pin's eyes began to shine with surprise. He couldn't believe that Vikyr wanted to subdue a colony, that even the Imperial Punitive Force had given up on using only barrels of oil. Vikyr began to stare at the monsters and his eyes began to shine with excitement and a smile spread across his face. Seeing this, Minnie Pin couldn't help but feel somewhat confused since he didn't know what the hell Vikyr was thinking. Following Vikyr's order, Minnie Pin brought some barrels of oil and both approached the entrance of the cave where the gnolls lived. The small monsters did not feel Vikyr's presence and entered the cave. Our boy approached the entrance and began to observe them from a corner. Not long after, the monsters turned around and their eyes began to shine with rage. Minnie Pin's eyes filled with fear and confusion. He didn't know how Vikyr was going to defeat so many gnolls. If he attacked without a plan, the gnolls could invade nearby villages. Our boy stood in front of the entrance and began to ponder. Minnie Pin's eyes widened with curiosity. He was sure that Vikyr would not overlook something like this. Vikyr began to walk toward the cave under the moonlight. Minnie Pin wanted to know how our boy was going to subjugate. Minnie Pin left the barrels of oil in front of the entrance of the cave, and both remained silent. While his eyes were shining with rage, Vikyr began to gaze toward the ground, and remembered that there were 3 entrances to the lair of the gnolls in this mountain. This was the entrance to the lair of low-level gnolls. Our boy closed his eyes, crouched down, and touched the ground. At that moment, mana began to emerge from his body and travel through the ground. Vikyr concentrated even more in the image of flying wine glasses, and a banquet came to his mind. The swordmasters were known as superhumans for a reason. After becoming one, he could feel the aura very clearly. Vikyr's mana began to emerge from his hand and travel through the ground. At first nothing happened, but several seconds later, small explosions occurred at the top of the mountain. The ground began to shake and Minnie Pin's eyes filled with fear and confusion. He didn't know what was happening. Not long after, the fierce gnolls, with eyes shining with rage, came out of the cave and began to charge towards them. But just then, Minnie Pin threw the barrels. Seeing this, the monsters' jaws dropped in shock. The barrels began to hit the monsters, releasing the oil. Minnie Pin began to throw the barrels with all his strength at the monsters. Vikyr, who was holding a torch, couldn't help but smile, since no one would have thought that he would end up using the same strategy he had used when living in the forest. His eyes began to shine with excitement, and a wicked smile spread across his face, although at that time his plan had not worked. This time it was going to work since he was only facing gnolls and not the manhwa. The oil began to soak the bodies of the monsters, while they were advancing towards our boy. With a wicked smile, Vikyr dropped the torch toward the monsters. Upon coming into contact with fire, the oil ignited. An intense blaze began to scorch the monsters, causing them terrible pain. The reason why fire was dangerous in an enclosed space was because it could spread, and the smoke it generated was poisonous. Since he had blocked off the upper entrances, there was no way for the smoke to escape, which caused it to sweep through the entire pack. The inside of the cave began to burn. Vikir and Mini Pin, who were standing at the entrance, started to watch the fire in silence. Mini Pin's eyes filled with surprise and confusion. Even though they were monsters, Vikir had not blinked when taking so many lives. He realized that he was much more cruel and meticulous than he had imagined. Feeling Mini Pin's gaze, Vikir turned his head, and while his eyes were shining with calmness, he remained silent. Mini Pin's eyes began to shine with admiration since, according to him, Vicky was very cool. Seeing this, with a confused gaze, our boy started touching his head. After a few hours, smoke began to emerge from the mountain, and upon entering inside with a torch, they saw that the cave was filled with gnoll corpses. Mini Pin began to examine the corpses and with a serious gaze mentioned that, as expected, the gnolls inside the cave had died from smoke inhalation. He had been in the hunting world for a long time, and this was something he had learned from Vikir. With a serene expression, Vikir began to walk through the cave, asking Mini Pin to forget about the compliments, since some gnolls might have survived, so they should not let their guard down. Mini Pin put his hand on his chest and couldn't help but feel happy to see that Vikir was worried about him. Vikir's eyes filled with confusion since looking at Mini Pin reminded him of Secretary General Chihuahua. They both began to walk through the cave, which was now full of monster corpses. Mini Pin's attention focused on one of the rocks and his eyes widened in surprise. Without wasting a second, he struck the rock using the sword. Upon seeing this, Vikir turned around and with a curious expression asked if there was any problem. Mini Pin began to strike the rocks with the sword and revealed that he could see man-made traces. Mini Pin struck hard, breaking the rocks and revealing a secret entrance. Mini Pin's and Vikir's eyes filled with surprise and fear, leaving them in shock. The secret entrance connected to a room which was full of gold coins. Vikir began to examine the coins, and it didn't take long for him to realize that someone had been using this room as a safe. With a surprised expression, Mini Pin mentioned that Vikir was jumping to conclusions, since the gnolls used to accumulate shiny things, so it could be that they had accumulated this. Vikir grabbed a gold coin while he was observing it, threw another in the air and asked Mini Pin to take a look. Mini Pin grabbed the coin and felt somewhat confused. Our boy revealed that these gold coins could not be released by the bank, because they did not have serial numbers, so there was no way the gnolls could have gotten them. Mini Pin did not know who would have the courage to keep their money inside the gnolls' lair. Vikir dropped the torch on the ground, stood up and made it clear that one thing was certain. That person was using this place as a treasure and was strong enough to kill all these gnolls and take the gold from them. At that moment, a woman wearing heels approached the cave and stepped hard on the corpse of one of the gnolls. She began licking her hand and with a smile realized that rats had gotten into her coin box. This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part, Vikir, who was holding the gold coin, stood up and with a serious expression made it clear that one thing was certain. Mini Pin's attention was fixed on the coin and his eyes filled with surprise and confusion, leaving him in shock. The cave was filled with gnoll corpses. The mysterious woman reached the entrance and began to observe the corpses in silence. The entrance to the secret treasure room was hidden in a part of the cave. Our boy revealed that the person who was using this place as storage was someone powerful who had the confidence to kill all the monsters and take the gold coins. Mini Pin began to examine the coins carefully without knowing if Vikir meant that all this loot had been stolen from a bank. Vikir nodded since otherwise it would not make sense for someone to be able to get these coins. With a gaze full of fear, Vikir began to imagine a newspaper and remembered that he had recently read news about the robbery of a bank. He remembered it well since he himself had been the one who had written the article. He knew that a copycat of the Hound continued committing crimes. That guy had destroyed important facilities in the imperial capital only to then disappear and take all the riches that were inside. Among those places there was also a bank. Moreover, all the witnesses had been murdered. And at the crime scene only the footprints of high heels and marks that seemed to be made by a gigantic snake were left behind, and from there that nickname had emerged. Just then, the mysterious woman drew her whip and swung it forcefully. She tried to attack Vikir, but our boy reacted in time and moving his head to one side, dodged the attack without much effort, causing the whip to hit against the wall of the cave. The whip left a mark that looked like it was made by a snake. Instead of panicking or feeling fear, Vekir's eyes began to shine with calm. Meanwhile, on the other side, Mini-Pin turned around and his eyes widened in surprise and terror. The mysterious woman picked up the whip and began to walk toward them with elegance. She grabbed the whip tightly and couldn't help but get angry upon seeing that rats had gotten into her coin box. Upon hearing this, Mini-Pin couldn't help but go into shock and feel somewhat confused. Our boy quickly realized that this woman was Ouroboros. She clenched her fist tightly and a smile spread across her face, while his eyes were shining with seriousness. Vekir's attention focused on the mark left on the wall by her whip. Realizing that the marks, which seemed to have been made by a gigantic snake, were actually marks left by a whip, he also noticed that she was using magic to distort her voice. With a smile, she extended her hand and couldn't help but feel confused and asked if finding her coin box was bad luck or good luck. With eyes shining with rage and hate, she began to stare fixedly at Vekir and Mini-Pin. Her attention was fixed on Vekir, and she couldn't help but grip the whip tightly since she didn't know what he was doing here. Vekir's eyes filled with confusion, leaving him in shock. With a gaze full of fear, Mini-Pin prepared to draw his sword. Our boy's mind filled with surprise, and his attention was fixed on her since he noticed that suddenly she had begun to become aware of something. He didn't know if she knew him. Ouroboros put her hand on top of the mask and couldn't help but laugh at the thought that she had good luck. Her eyes began to shine with malice, and an excited smile spread across her face. She couldn't believe that Vekir had entered by himself into her coin box. She began to use her power, causing a powerful mana to start emerging from her body. Mini-Pin drew his sword without knowing what was happening. Vekir, who was standing behind, started observing her and instead of panicking, remained calm, realizing that her mana was intense. She was stronger than a graduator. Mini-Pin, who had a low graduator rank, wasn't going to be a match for her. His eyes began to shine with determination since he knew that it was him who had to fight against her. But he was afraid since if he showed his true power to someone who already knew him and let them escape, the danger was going to increase, so he didn't know what to do. While Ouroboros' body was releasing an intense aura, with a serene gaze, Vekir began to ponder in silence. Mini-Pin turned around and his gaze fixed on Vekir, making his eyes widen in confusion. Realizing that our boy had many things on his mind, Vekir began looking at the ground. It was true that although he was a genius revered as a hero, facing Miss Ouroboros, who was stronger than a graduator, was going to be terrifying. Mini-Pin stood in front of Vekir and with a sincere expression mentioned that at this hour the Imperial Guard would be patrolling around the base of the mountain. Upon hearing this, Vekir came out of his thoughts and his eyes widened in surprise, leaving him somewhat confused. Mini-Pin drew his sword and began to imbue it with his mana, making golden mana appear around his body, clenching his teeth with a gaze full of determination. He promised to do everything possible so that Vekir could reach the entrance of the cave, and then escape and call the Imperial Guard. Vekir was somewhat confused, while Mini-Pin's eyes were shining with confidence. With a smile he made it clear that for him it had been an honor to meet Vekir, even if it had been for a short time. Without wasting any more time, Mini-Pin filled himself with determination and began to charge toward Ouroboros. Using all his strength, he grabbed the sword and prepared to attack. As he was slowly getting closer, Ouroboros remained still. Mini-Pin swung the sword forcefully, but to his surprise, Ouroboros reacted in time and dodging the attack and causing his sword to hit the ground. Seeing this, Mini-Pin couldn't help but grit his teeth and feel furious. He didn't know what was happening. He swung the sword forcefully again, but Ouroboros jumped back and dodged the attack once more, making his sword hit the cave wall. She began to imbue her mana into the whip and felt excited to see that this guy had gone crazy. Just before Mini-Pin could react, she attacked with a fierce lash, hitting him under the jaw and making him lose consciousness. The attack was so powerful that it made a deep cut on Mini-Pin's face. He began to retreat until several seconds later, he stomped the ground forcefully. Mini-Pin started to bleed and dropped his sword, which fell to the ground. His body began to tremble. He had lost consciousness for a moment due to the blow. He felt as if his flesh was being torn apart and his bones crushed by that whip. Even though both were graduates, the skill gap was very large due to the difference in rank. Eyes full of rage, Minnie-Pin began to stare at her. Then he put his arms in front of his face and began to concentrate, causing golden mana to emerge from his body. Ouroboros decided not to stand idly by. She attacked again several times using the whip. Her attacks did quite a bit of damage to Minnie-Pin, causing small cuts all over his body. While the whip was tearing his flesh apart, Minnie-Pin stood firm and thought about Vikir. Our boy was a person who one day would become a sword master, and for him it was a shame that Vikir died in this place. Then a smile spread across Minnie-Pin's face. Upon seeing this, Ouroboros' eyes filled with fear and confusion, leaving her in shock. With eyes shining with rage and determination, Minnie-Pin lunged at her and prepared to attack, since his mission was to die protecting Vikir in this place. But just then, Vikir asked him not to waste his life, and then launched Spider's Silk, which stuck to Ouroboros' mask, making her panic. Upon seeing this, Minnie-Pin clenched his teeth tightly, not knowing what was happening. Ouroboros put her hand on top of the mask and felt furious as she didn't know what this sticky thing was, but she was aware that she had to remove it quickly. While she was distracted, with eyes shining with rage, Vikir appeared behind her. Just before she could take another breath, Vikir gave her a strong kick in the ribs. The blow was so strong that she clenched her teeth and started to bleed. Seeing this, Minnie-Pin's eyes widened in surprise. He couldn't believe that Vikir was so strong. Vikir's kick made Ouroboros' body crash against the cave wall, creating a large curtain of smoke and making the whole mountain shake. Resting his hand on Minnie-Pin's shoulder, our boy praised him for being strong. Minnie-Pin turned his head toward him and his eyes widened in surprise. He couldn't believe that Vikir was praising him again. With her mouth full of blood, Ouroboros put her hands on her back and couldn't help but grit her teeth according to her. The power that Vikir had was not normal. Minnie-Pin's body was full of wounds and he couldn't walk. Vikir carried Minnie-Pin's body on his back and his eyes began to shine with seriousness. He knew he wouldn't be able to defeat Ouroboros with just one blow, but he also couldn't show either her or Minnie-Pin the realm of Swordmaster, so he decided to take this opportunity to leave. Vikir carried Minnie-Pin on his back and began to walk toward the exit of the cave. Ouroboros, who was sitting on the ground, asked where he thought he was going. A few seconds later, they reached the exit of the cave and could see the beautiful moonlight. Just then, with an arrogant gaze, Vikir turned around and advised her to run away quickly since soon they were going to return to the cave along with the Imperial Guard. With her body trembling, Ouroboros placed her hand on top of the ground and couldn't help but feel furious. All Vikir's eyes were shining. With a smile he made it clear that if she was planning to touch his coin box, then she should be prepared to suffer the consequences. He said goodbye to her. Ouroboros clenched her teeth and cursed Vikir under her breath. The only thing she could do was call Vikir bastard. Several minutes had already passed and Minnie-Pin had lost consciousness. Under the moonlight, Vikir, who was carrying Minnie-Pin on his back, arrived at the forest. He couldn't help but smile since for him this was incredible. He had thought that he had lived enough, but there were still many things about himself that he was learning. Vikir began to remember what Minnie-Pin and Chihuahua had done for him in the past. And by doing this, the memory of himself from his past life came to his mind. Under the moonlight, Vikir began to walk toward the place where the Imperial Guard was patrolling. Minnie-Pin's loyal appearance reminded him of himself from the past. This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part,